This is God Delusion number 14. We stopped last time in chapter 4, which is entitled Why There Almost Certainly Is No God. Now he's going to talk about irreducible complexity, which basically what he's saying is that creationists say that you can't break down. Irreducible complexity means when you get to a certain point, you can't break down a unit into smaller units. In other words, the body would have to form all by itself as one unit. And so you can't explain life through Darwinian natural selection, because Darwinian natural selection says the eye can form by itself, the nose can form by itself, all these things can form by itself and put together, and creationists say no, it has to be formed all in one. It's irreducible complexity, therefore evolution is false. Well, the principle of irreducible complexity is irrelevant. It doesn't matter. Take for example these glasses that I wear. You can say that irreducible complexity, the glasses have to be formed in that one unit just like they are. Or you can say that they can be reduced into 10 different components. Whatever your argument, the fact still remains that the glasses have to be created. And if you break it down into the 10 elements, you say, okay, well the screw could have been formed by itself. It didn't have to be formed as part of the glasses unit. Okay, well you say that and that's fine, but still the screw would have to be formed in exactly the exact shape that it needs to be formed into, and everything be perfect with it in order for it to fit precisely into the eyeglass frame. So it doesn't really matter if you say, well, the eyeglasses have to be formed all together, or they can be formed as separate units in different parts. It doesn't matter what you say. Either way, the eyeglasses have to be formed, and they have to be formed as they are. And when you break it down into components, then that makes it even less likely, because what are the chances that a screw would be formed exactly the right proportion to fit into some random eyeglass frame that was formed completely different from it? So really the argument that Dawkins says, where creationists say irreducible complexity, and Dawkins says no, that's not true, everything can be formed by itself. What Dawkins does is he just makes it harder on himself now to explain life, because now, well, if it all formed together, then that makes sense that the screw would be the right size for the eyeglasses. But if they form by themselves, well, what are the chances that it would be exactly the right size? So he thinks by saying, the problem is Dawkins says, well, things couldn't happen by chance, so it wouldn't all form by itself together at one spot like that. The human body, for example, just wouldn't form, poof, here it is. That's silly. Well, it's even sillier to think that it would form in pieces by itself, and somehow the pieces would magically fit together, because there's no purpose or no design behind it. And he gives, again, so, well, the law of natural selection. Where does that law come from? The law comes from a lawmaker. So if natural selection is a law, and it forms by that law and it's non-random, then by admitting that there is a law, Dawkins is admitting that there is a creator, because there is a creator who made the law. Whether a creator makes the human body, or the creator creates a law and through the law makes the human body, either way, Dawkins has admitted that there is a creator by admitting there is a law. So by him saying that there's no randomness or chance, that as he said, the eagle's eye was really the end product of a long sequence of non-random but purely natural causes, then he has admitted that there is a God. Okay, so under irreducible complexity, he says, quote, chance is not the likely designer. That is one thing on which we can all agree. once he eliminates chance, he's eliminated. He's really said that there is a God. He may not say that there is a creator God who exists forever in the cosmos, but he's at least created a God of the law of natural selection. He says, quote, natural selection is the only workable alternative to chance that has ever been suggested. Intelligent design suffers from exactly the same objection as chance. It is simply not a plausible solution to the riddle of statistical improbability, end quote. So he starts off the chapter by saying there are two ways that something happened, either God or natural selection. Well, now he's just eliminated God. And I don't see how intelligent design suffers from the same objection as chance, because intelligent design has intelligence to create something. Natural selection is not a workable alternative to chance, because there is no creator behind it. How could something happen by natural selection non-randomly without some design to it? So, okay, the eyeglass, or in the example of the eagle that he gives, the eagle eye somehow forms. It's very, very improbable, as he readily admits, but it's possible that this eagle eye formed. Okay, the eagle eye formed. Well, then the wing formed and the claw formed, all equally improbable. Well, what's even astronomically improbable is the fact that all of these three things, and we're just talking about three things, the eye, the wing, and the claw, somehow fit together perfectly for that body. It's sort of like, you know, when you have a jigsaw puzzle, you got all these different pieces. For it, you know, those pieces have to fit perfectly. 1,000-piece puzzle, you can get some pieces that are very close to other pieces, but they don't quite fit perfectly. They have to fit perfectly for it to go into that puzzle. So the chance that an eye, a wing, feathers, and all these different things form by themselves, and yet they form perfectly as one unit, is very improbable. The only explanation for these individual pieces forming perfectly to come together would be an intelligent design, just like the jigsaw puzzle, is that the reason the pieces fit perfectly is they were designed that way, an intelligent design. So really, intelligent design does not suffer from the same objection as chance. Chance, it just randomly happens. There's no way the eye and the wing and the claw and the body would all fit together for this eagle to function perfectly by chance. But if there's an intelligent design, that solves the problem right there. The design of the eye was made to fit the body, which was made to fit the wing, which was made to fit the claw, and it was all made to fit together. Natural selection suffers from the same problem as chance, because if you break it up into those individual pieces and say each one is improbable to form like they are, well, it's certainly very, very improbable that they would all work together perfectly. Statistically, he says the riddle of statistical improbability, I would say if you're saying it's very, very improbable for an eye to form, very, very improbable for a wing to form, very, very improbable for a body to form, it would really be statistically impossible for all of those to form independently of each other, but yet somehow come together and work perfectly together if there is no design behind it. He says, quote, the designer himself, herself, itself immediately raises the bigger problem of his own origin, end quote. He says later on, he asks the question, who designed the designer? And I think that's what he's getting at when he mentioned at the end of chapter 3 that he would use the argument for chapter 4 to state that who made God? That would be his argument. Well, if there has to be somebody who made God, then yes, that that is a problem. But the thing is, the answer to who made God is no one. See, if the question is who made God, then whoever made God is now God. So then who made the God and made the God? Well, then whoever made the God and made the God is now God. So the God who made the God that made the God is now God. So then there's got to be a God who made the God that made the God that made the God. So you keep having this endless problem.
Well, it goes with the Big Bang Theory. Who made the asteroid? Who made the asteroid and made the asteroid? Then who made the asteroid and made the asteroid that caused the Big Bang? Or who made the Big Bang? How did it, who made the dust? Who made the dust that made the dust that made the dust, So
yeah, when Dawkins goes through natural selection, he's going to explain later on how life came to be about on the earth, and in so doing, he makes this problem even worse because he does just what Lana talked about. He assumes something much, 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 much bigger than Earth was in existence in order for life to come upon Earth. Well, how did all this stuff come about if without it being created? He creates just a bigger problem. And so that's what he's using, that mindset. He's thinking, well, who made God? So someone had to make God, then that makes him God. So then who made him? And so he sees this as an endless problem. But first off, that same problem that he says is the reason why there can't be a God is, as Lana mentions, the reason that natural selection can't be true. Because where did the particles come from? Well, they come from smaller particles. Where do those come from? Well, smaller particles. Where do those come from? Eventually, you get to the point where something was made. Something was created. If nothing existed, and then somehow something existed, no matter how small that something is, the only way something comes out of nothing is if somebody created that. So where did that come from? So he's really got the same problem. He says, well, yeah, God, that doesn't make any sense that God made the world, because who made God? Well, it doesn't make any sense that evolution or natural selection made life, because who made the elements that came from natural selection? There has to be creator at some point. You can't just get infinitely and infinitely more smaller to the point where, okay, well, that first tiny particle that can't be seen by the naked eye, then since it can't be seen, then it's plausible that it appeared out of nothing. No, something does not appear out of nothing. No matter how small you make that something, it cannot appear out of nothing. There has to be creator of that small little tiny particle that everything started from. What do they call it? Crystal, somebody said, but someone else said dust, galaxy dust, or some kind of dust.
Crystal, somebody said dust.
Yeah.
Even the atheists can't even agree how the Big Bang came about, or what the particles were, because one guy said crystal, another guy said dust, and this came from Ben Stein's
Expelled.
He actually interviewed a lot of these so-called scientists, atheists, and they didn't even agree.
Yeah, and so Dawkins says the designer himself, herself, itself immediately raises the bigger problem of his own origin. Well, the Big Bang itself immediately raises the bigger problem of its own origin. So by Dawkins admitting that a God can't exist because someone had to make God, he admits the particles can't exist. But the thing is, the answer to the solution and the reason we know that God existed and why it's so rational for this to happen, not only is it what we've talked about, how there is a conscience and you know that there's a creator, the evidence shows it, your conscience within you tells you that God created you, but the answer simply to the question, who made God, is no one. He has always existed. I'll give you a couple of scriptures that talk about this. And yes, go ahead.
Before you read the scripture, Dawkins is saying that there is no God because, we say that nobody created God, but he's doing the same thing with the Big Bang, saying nothing created the Big Bang, it just showed up. So he's canceling himself out. It's funny, he accuses Christians of believing a God that existed without being created by somebody else, and he's doing the same with the Big Bang.
Yeah, Dawkins, by his own argument against Christians, tears down his own theory. In Hebrews 7, it talks about Melchizedek, which I won't have time to go into, but basically this is another word for God the Son, the Lord Jesus Christ. So this is God himself, God the Son, and it says about him in Hebrews 7:3, without father, without mother, without descent, having neither beginning of days nor end of life, but made like unto the Son of God, abideth a priest continually. So it tells you there that God doesn't have father, he doesn't have mother, he doesn't have descent, he doesn't have beginning of days or end of life. In Genesis 1:1, it says, in the beginning, God created the heaven and the earth. John 1:1 says, in the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. You say, well, what's the beginning? Well, the beginning is the beginning of heaven and earth. God doesn't have a beginning. He has always existed. But the beginning then would be the beginning of the heaven and earth, when God began to create. But Revelation 1:11, God says, I am Alpha and Omega, the first and the last. And over in Revelation, I think it's Revelation 22, he says, Revelation 22:13, I am Alpha and Omega, the beginning and the end, the first and the last. So not only does God not have a beginning or an end, but because he doesn't have a beginning or an end, he defines when the beginning or the end is. He was in existence before the beginning. So then in the beginning, God created the heaven and the earth. His existence is before the beginning. Now you'll say, well, that doesn't make sense. Something always has to have a beginning, and something always has to have an ending. And that's true in the material world, because it's in the beginning that God created the heaven and the earth. So since he created the heaven and the earth in the beginning, what that beginning is the beginning of time. And then when God ushers in the dispensation of the fullness of times, that's when he says time is no more. In Revelation 10, verse 5, it says, the angel which I saw stand upon the sea and upon the earth lifted up his hand to heaven, and swear by him that liveth forever and ever, who created heaven and the things that therein are, and the earth and the things that therein are, and the sea and the things which are therein, that there should be time no longer. So God creates time when he creates the heaven and the earth. And then when heaven and earth pass away and he sets up his kingdom on earth and begins the dispensation of the fullness of times, he declares that time is no longer. So God creates time and he ends time, which shows he's outside of time and he doesn't have a beginning or an end. But see, everything in the material world, because everything in this earth is created by God, it has a beginning and it has an end. So then we can't understand how God could always exist, because everything in our material world has a beginning and has an end. You know, a redwood tree may last 2,000 years, but it still had a beginning 2,000 years ago and is going to have an end, you know, into the future, maybe 1,000 years later, who knows. It has a beginning, it has an end. That's in the material world. So if God, John 4:24 says God is a spirit. So since God is a spirit and he doesn't have a beginning or end, then we know that in the spirit realm, time does not exist. That's why the dispensation of the fullness of times, Ephesians 1:10 talks about that. God can declare time no longer when he brings that spirit realm to coexist with the material realm here when heaven and earth pass away. So the spirit realm, there is no time in that realm, which means that God can always exist and will always exist as well. And when we become part of that spirit realm ourselves, that's why time is no longer for us as well. John 3:16 says, God so loved the world that he gave his only begotten Son, that whosoever believeth in him should not perish, but have everlasting life. He gives you eternal or everlasting life, life that will never end. You say, well, that's not possible. It's not possible in the material realm because the wages of sin is death. And so when man sinned, he died. But when God takes care of Satan and gets him out of the way, then he can bring the spirit realm into the material realm, and we can live forever with God in that spirit realm. So since God promises us eternal life, it makes sense that God can also live outside of time. He lives for, we're going to live forever when he puts us into the spirit realm. Therefore, it can also make sense that since God was always in the spirit realm, that God has always existed. Now, everything else has been created. So, again, when he says, who made God? Well, understanding that answer, and the Bible tells us he has no descent, and he is the beginning and the end. So trying to find out who made God, the answer is no one. And then it makes it crystal clear that God created everything. And so the only plausible explanation for life is that God created it, because he was the only one here to create whatever it is, whether you start it with a full human body or you start it with a minuscule particle. Since God was the only one here, God had to create it.